On April 2nd, 2025, the world woke up to a shockwave. In a bold move that echoed across continents, former US President Donald Trump, back in office for a second term, announced sweeping new tariffs that would overhaul decades of global trade relationships. The announcement was made with his trademark bravado, declaring April 2nd as Liberation Day, a symbolic break from what he called decades of American exploitation at the hands of foreign powers. Trump's new trade policy imposed a baseline 10% tariff on all US imports, with special penalties of up to 50% levied on so-called worst offenders, many of them developing nations, particularly in Africa. The announcement wasn't just about trade. It felt like a seismic event that rattled not just financial markets, but also the lives and futures of millions. And nowhere has the fallout been more visceral than across the African continent, where the line between economic stability and chaos has always been precariously thin. What began as a strategy to rein in trade imbalances with China and European powers quickly morphed into a blanket policy that spared very few. Under the authority of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, Trump declared a national economic emergency, setting the stage for a two-tier tariff regime. 1. Baseline tariff, a universal 10% duty slapped on all imports into the United States, regardless of origin. 2. Reciprocal tariffs, punitive rates up to 50% on countries with significant trade surpluses or high non-tariff barriers, as calculated by a controversial formula. The White House insisted this was about fairness. If they tax us, we tax them, Trump proclaimed. But economists, trade analysts, and global leaders saw it differently. For many, especially smaller economies in Africa, the policy felt less like economic rebalancing and more like punishment. The formula behind these tariffs has come under sharp scrutiny. By dividing the US trade deficit with a country by the total volume of imports from that country and then halving that number, the Trump administration sought to establish a sense of proportionality. In reality, it produced wildly skewed results. Take Lesotho, for instance, a landlocked country with a modest economy and minimal US trade volumes. Lesotho suddenly found its textile exports facing a 50% tariff. The irony? Lesotho had long benefited from the African Growth and Opportunity Act, the AGOA, which provided duty-free access to US markets as a pathway to development. Now, that pathway is collapsing. The Lesotho textile industry, once hailed as a model for how trade could empower women and lift communities out of poverty, is crumbling under the weight of these tariffs. For a factory worker who's spent 10 years stitching garments headed for American shelves, the impact isn't just financial, it's deeply personal. It's the fear of job loss, the dread of not being able to pay rent or school fees, and the slow unraveling of hope. Lesotho is just one piece of a larger mosaic. Across Africa, countries heavily dependent on US exports are watching their economic prospects dim. In Madagascar, where textiles and vanilla dominate the export economy, tariffs approaching 47% threaten the livelihood of thousands. Already, factory owners are making tough decisions, cutting hours, reducing workforce, or shutting down entirely. Meanwhile, in Ivory Coast, the world's largest cocoa producer, a 21% tariff on cocoa exports could not come at the worst time. For cocoa farmers, many of whom live in rural villages with few alternative sources of income, this isn't just a market correction, it's an existential threat. A similar story plays out in Ghana, Kenya, and Ethiopia, where agricultural exports like coffee, tea, and horticultural products face steep levies. The higher cost will likely make these goods uncompetitive in the US market, causing a ripple effect. Exporters lose contracts, farmers lose income, and families lose stability. Perhaps no country on the continent feels the blow as deeply as South Africa. A regional powerhouse with a diversified export base, South Africa had long enjoyed a relatively stable trade relationship with the US through AGOA, but under the new regime, tariffs of up to 31% are now applied to a broad range of exports, including automobiles, a critical sector for the nation's economy. South Africa's automobile industry employs hundreds of thousands and supports a complex network of suppliers, small businesses, and logistic providers. The 31% tariff effectively prices South African-made cars out of the US market, threatening a collapse in exports and setting off alarm bells amongst manufacturers. The potential for retaliatory tariffs add yet another layer of uncertainty. What makes this crisis particularly painful is that the real cost isn't just economic, it's human. These aren't abstract shifts on trade balance sheets, they are job losses, factory closures, and crushed aspirations. In Lesotho, thousands of women who relied on garment jobs to support their families are now facing unemployment. In Ivory Coast, smallholder cocoa farmers, already vulnerable to climate change and price volatility, are now battling a new foe: exclusion from global trade. In Nigeria, where inflation and currency instability already make life hard, the government recently offloaded $200 million from its reserves to stabilize the naira after market shocks triggered by the US policy. Inflationary pressure from increased import costs could drive up the prices of food, fuel, and medicine, making it even harder for ordinary Nigerians to survive. Yet, amid the wreckage, African countries are showing a remarkable capacity to adapt. One lesson has become clear: over-reliance on any one trade partner, especially one as unpredictable as Trump's America, is dangerous. In response, many African governments are turning their gaze eastward. China, now Africa's largest trade partner, has stepped in to offer tariff-free access on several African products, providing a potential lifeline. Meanwhile, countries are doubling down on regional trade through the African Continental Free Trade Area (AfCFTA), a landmark initiative aimed at creating a unified African market. AfCFTA's potential is massive. By reducing trade barriers between African countries and encouraging intra-African trade, the continent could cushion itself against future global shocks. It's not just about economics anymore. It's a matter of sovereignty, resilience, and long-term survival. Rather than retaliate with tariffs of their own, an unlikely move for most developing economies, African nations are turning to diplomacy and legal recourse. South Africa, for example, is engaging US officials in quiet but firm negotiations, hoping to carve out exemptions for vulnerable industries. Several African countries are also preparing to challenge the tariffs at the World Trade Organization (WTO), arguing that they violate the basic principles of multilateral trade. While these efforts may take time, they reflect a broader determination not to absorb the blow simply, but to push back strategically and defend hard-won economic gains. The Trump tariffs signify more than just a change in US trade policy. They mark a fundamental shift in the global economic order. For decades, international trade was built on principles of multilateralism, cooperation, and mutual benefit. AGOA itself was emblematic of this vision, offering African countries a pathway to develop through market access rather than aid. Now, that vision is in question. The new US approach, rooted in unilateralism and short-term political wins, risks igniting a domino effect of protectionism. If other nations follow suit, global trade could descend into a fragmented mess of tit-for-tat measures, leaving developing countries, particularly in Africa, fighting for scraps in a hostile environment. At the heart of this crisis are the people who rarely make headlines. The seamstress in Lesotho who now walks past a shuttered factory with no idea how she will feed her children. The cocoa farmer in Ivory Coast is wondering if his next harvest will rot unsold. The Kenyan entrepreneur is watching others dry up, fearing bankruptcy. Trade is not just about GDP or export values. It's about people. It's about lives, dreams, and dignity. And the deeper we dive into the impact of Trump's tariffs, the more we must center these human stories. Still, within this economic earthquake lies a strange opportunity. African countries are being forced to confront long-standing structural weaknesses and reimagine their place in the world economy. There is a new urgency to diversify exports, invest in local industries, and develop value-added processing that reduces reliance on raw material exports. The future of Africans' economic sovereignty may very well depend on how the continent responds to this moment. Will it emerge fractured and weakened, or more united, self-reliant, and innovative? As the dust settles, one thing is clear. The Trump tariffs are not just a blip on the economic radar, they are a turning point. Whether they will ultimately serve as a cautionary tale or a spark for transformation depends on what happens next. For Africa, the stakes are high, but so too is the determination. In the words of one Malawian trade official, we may have been pushed down, but we are not staying down. This is our wake-up call. In the end, this is not just a story about tariffs. It's a story about people, about families striving for a better life, about countries navigating turbulent waters, and about a continent at a crossroads. As the world recalibrates, the challenge will be to build a more just, inclusive, and balanced global economy that doesn't leave the most vulnerable behind. And in doing so, we must never forget the faces behind the figures. Because behind every trade policy, there is a person, and every person deserves the chance not just to survive, but to thrive. Thank you for watching. Until next time.